benefit, or relief as it was known, from the parish rates. But as the rates increased, a storm of protest grew. Relief was seen as a subsidy that enabled employers to pay low wages. It was regarded as a disincentive to the unemployed to find work, and it was felt wrong to be supporting unmarried mothers. The solution was to build workhouses. The poor would be helped, but it would cost them their dignity, their pride, and their freedom.
They didn't even let us kiss each other goodbye. They just took my husband away, and I can still hear my children screaming today when they took them up that corridor. I really can. They screamed like I don't know what.
And he said one day he was sent to scrub a toilet block which was always outside. He said, and it was bitter cold weather and his fingers were bleeding from the cold, and they were children. And they had to do that, but if any job wasn't done right, that called for punishment and no meals.
I grew up with an image of Workhouse that was hated. Although, as a historian, I have to look at the evidence from every aspect. At the end of the day, I can't get away from that original feeling that I first had about the workhouses, that they were bad, they were evil, and they really typified a society which sought to punish the poor. When the new Poor Law was passed in 1834 and the workhouses were officially established nationally, talk was of building a proper workhouse for Birmingham. Eventually this was built in 1852. It was a cost of £44,476, a tremendous sum for those days. Like most workhouses, the Birmingham Workhouse was built a little bit away from the main centre of population in Birmingham so that there couldn't be any attacks on it by the local people. Within the workhouse there was room for 1,610 people, or rather, in the horrible language of the time, inmates. Behind me is an archway which was the main entrance to the main section of the workhouse building. Many local people say that this archway was called the Archway of Tears, and it does sum up evocatively the feeling that local people, Birmingham people, would have had when they came into the workhouse. This would probably, at this site, been the last site they had of freedom. Once they went through that archway, they were there forever, if they were old, if they were sick.
Much of the old Birmingham Workhouse was demolished in the 1970s, but some of it survived right up to last year. Just days before it was finally due to be flattened, local historian Dr. Carl Chin took a walk into the past.
This is the male reception room. It's one half of the building that's just inside the archway. The other half is where females would have gone. In this male half, the men would have realised that this is where they were going to be robbed of their dignity and of their independence. They'd have came into a male receiving ward. Once in that ward, they'd have had their clothes taken from them, their personal possessions, and even their tobacco. And even today, 50 years after the workhouse system was ended, you can still feel the sadness in this room. It's not surprising, really, because it was in this room that the poverty-stricken realised that they'd lost control over their lives.
They said to me I was going to have a bath, and so were the children. When we got into this place where the bathroom was, they just got my two kiddies and took them away and didn't say to Mummy or anything. They just took them. And I can still hear my children screaming today when they took them up that corridor. I really can. They screamed like I don't know what. And next morning we were all herded along these long corridors. And then I saw my husband, and he was in like a uniform too. And naturally we went to embrace each other. And this fella that was in the uniform, looked like a prisoner's officers, came to us and parted us. I said to my husband, women can't talk to men, and vice versa. So my husband picked up and said, it's my wife. And they said, I'm sorry. He said, you can only speak to each other on visiting days. So he said, and when's that? He said, 2 hours once a month. We used to pretend we're going out to the toilet of an evening. And we'd got a pre-arranged signal that we'd meet each other behind the laundry. Eventually they would come looking for us and find us, but we'd had a chance to have a cuddle.
Where I'm standing on the first floor was really the hub of the old workhouse. This is the place where all the various departments of the workhouse met. Over there in front of me was the part of the main corridor which led to the female departments. And departments is the word, because although all the women lived in the one section, they were split up, as were the men, according to their age, according to whether or not they were able-bodied, according to whether they were epileptic, etc. Behind me here, through these iron gates, was the corridor, the main corridor, which led to the men's section. The iron gates were there quite simply to stop the females and the males meeting each other. They were segregated completely. There was this gallery here on the first floor, and also a gallery on the second floor, which would look down on the main corridor below and make sure that there was no meeting of the different people within the workhouse. It's a very bleak scene, it's very forbidding. There's no wallpaper, there's no curtains, there's no heating. A little bit of an attempt's been made over there to paint some curtains onto a window, but it still looks very inhospitable. And you can just imagine actually what it must have been like for a family to have to come into the workhouse.
Families were admitted, yes, from time to time. We tried, obviously, we weren't keen, and as time went on, we kept trying to press outdoor relief where possible to be granted to families, but from time to time we had a family, they were split up. There was no family accommodation. The man would have to go to the men's block, the woman would go to the women's block, with babies. She would be young babies and young children with her, and then either direct or after a day or two, the children, older children, would go to a children's home. There were a series of children's homes around the local authorities, and they would go to a home with the children. But they were split up, yeah. I wouldn't say that there was a judgmental, punitive attitude to families, but today's present philosophy of caring and that sort of thing was not much in evidence in those days. It was just a different philosophy, a different outlook. Because one of the elements of administration in those days was to give the family every incentive to get itself together and get out.
In the case of Leon Duff, the incentive worked. He jumped the wall and ran away. 3 weeks later, he returned and told the workhouse master and Muriel that he had a job and somewhere to stay. They were going home.
As soon as we got through that great big archway, my husband turned around and he said, I'm sorry, Muriel, we haven't got anywhere to go. I told the lawyer on purpose to get you out. I just couldn't take any more of it. So I thought, no matter what happens, I'm not going back in there. I've had enough. And so my children and husband, we're staying together as a family. Whatever happens, we're out. And we did. And we squatted and we did all sorts of things before we did eventually get a house. And we didn't mind the hardship of that at all. That was nothing to the workhouse.
Workhouses were built on the liberal principles of self-improvement, efficiency and organisation. They were big institutions, the size often of small villages. Nowhere is the scale, the sheer size of workhouses more evident than in here, the kitchen of the Birmingham Union Workhouse. It's absolutely huge.
Yes, as workhouse master, I was expected to administer what was almost like a small village. It had its own farm, its own bakery, its own very highly developed sports facilities, and then of course this population of something approaching 2,000. We had 2,000 beds, but we rarely filled them all, but at times we would have 1,600 people, plus a bit with the farm and the pigs. We had quite a number of pigs. The food was not very fancy. There was a lot of bread, a lot of margarine, a lot of potatoes, soup. Meat would be no more than maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
Times were hard for everyone. You were better in the workhouse. You were sure of a meal, but you weren't always sure of a meal if you were out. And I do remember she took me into the kitchen. You remember the old-fashioned boilers we had in the houses here? They'd got one with porridge in. I remember that. And I think it was soup or something in the other one. I couldn't be sure what it was. But it smelt like stew. I remember that because I remember thinking to myself, oh, I wouldn't mind a basin of that. And I was only a youngster. And there was it looked like a great big black range with large ovens. There was a big bread pudding, and I had a piece. It was quite nice.
The bulls that they used to kill, or the cows that they used to kill, them days they were old. They were that old, they couldn't even walk to the slaughterhouse, if you understand me. And they were full of fat and gristle. You never see no gristle in meat today. And it was full of gristle in the fat. And I used to see it floating, I just couldn't bear it. But I had to sit there and chew it until I'd ate it.
Another workhouse, another time. For a child growing up in a workhouse, life was harsh and regimented. Birmingham artist Frank Smith has painted his autobiography, beginning with his childhood in the workhouse. In the late 1920s, Frank's mother was in service to a wealthy merchant. When she became pregnant, she lost her job and her home. Like many unmarried mothers at that time, she was a social outcast. The only refuge available to her was the workhouse. On the 22nd of April 1928, Frank Sidney Smith was born in Thurrock Workhouse. As he grew up, he painted the nightmares and fears of the workhouse child.
They used to take us out around the workhouse, and I remember so strongly seeing the people that had worked, and some of them with sad faces in them, and it was hard for some of the people to take what they had to do there, because it was a lot of work for them to do. People like me, whether they had a baby, were working in areas where they had to go around the workhouse itself, doing the scrubbing out, and scrubbing the steps, and cleaning out the dormitories that they were living in. Always would have to get the wood in and load the fire, the boilers, and bring in the coal. They had one fire in every building where they could just sort of keep warm, but that wasn't enough. They got chilblain because it was so cold. Although you was in the workhouse and you was brought up by house mothers and fathers, it still wasn't the same as your own mother. And I felt very sorry for my mother when she used to come down and see me sometimes, because at that stage my mother used to bring some sweets to give to us and also a comic, and she would say to me, oh, you haven't spoke, Frank. Well, it was because I was glued to the comic. The outside world was hard to explain to a child that is born in the workhouse. You imagine what it must be like, and it gave you some sort of an ambition. You always wanted to be an outsider one day, but when that day comes, it hits you, and then when you come out into the world, you just don't know what it's like.
Single mothers, yes, there was a judgmental attitude towards them. Your main concern was to make sure that they didn't decamp without the baby, and there were, almost security arrangements. At some stages, I think they were locked in at nights, or if they showed any tendency to abscond, they were locked in at nights. And there was another big hazard, because one of the grounds for consideration for certification under the Mental Deficiency Act was to have given birth to a child without the ability to maintain it. Now that was a ground for consideration of feeble-mindedness, which was a case then for certification under the Mental Deficiency Act, which, subject to review at 5-year intervals, was for life.
I'm standing in the cellars beneath the main building of the workhouse. It's quite cold and miserable down here, and the pipes that you can see above me obviously runs here when it was a workhouse. It's likely that most of the rooms down here were used for storage, but there are rumours that some of them were punishment cells. Certainly, the 1834 Act which set up workhouses specified that each workhouse should have punishment cells. And when you look at the thickness and size of this door behind me, it does make you wonder whether it was a door to keep people out or whether it was a door to keep the disorderlies in.
Mrs. Mary MacDonald recalls the workhouse treatment of a relative. Just after the turn of the century, he was admitted to Birmingham Workhouse, suffering from epilepsy.
When he went in, they were separated from the other people if they knew a fit was coming on, because there were other people that had fits and they could harm one another. So they were in a room, I don't know whether it was a cellar or what you'd call it, but it was down. I wouldn't go down, I didn't like the looks of it. But there were bars there, and my uncle said it was quite safe. If they didn't put them there, they'd be killing one another. And they were put there for their own protection.
When she was taken through the door, they used to put them in the cells underground until they'd found a room to put them in for sleeping. And they were left there for hours, not just 5 minutes. Mum said she was there for hours.
Harsh treatment for a 4-year-old child, even in 1906. But Rene Kimberley's mother, Harriet, was no stranger to brutality.
Well, my grandfather worked on a barge, and I don't suppose they had a lot of money, but I started off with 3 children, and my mother was the oldest of those. But he was a drinker, and when he came home at night, everybody suffered. The mother, the children. He broke my mother's leg, because she was just trying to defend the mother, and she'd no chance. He was a big man.
His drinking also meant the family was frequently in debt. When the rent and bills were not paid, the authorities took mother and children into the workhouse.
Black and I used to come daytime or night time and just take Mum. It didn't matter what she was doing in her sleep. The mother used to come up and say, "Harriet, we've got to go now." And she used to say there was little babies in there, small children, babies in arms, put in little cradles, all taken away from the families. And when they got into the gate, they were segregated.
Traumatised and separated from her children, Harriet's mother was determined to maintain what little contact she could with her family.
Mum found out that her mother was working in the bakehouse, and she was the other side of the wall, and she used to call Mum when she thought she was there. Mum said she used to stand by the wall because she knew her mother was working there, and her mother used to shout, "Are you there, Harriet?" And she'd say yes, and she'd throw her a cake over the wall.
But in those days, the workhouse was no place to break the rules. Penalties were harsh.
Mum wet herself through fright of some sort, and they gave her a punishment of scrubbing 3 flights of steps and carbolic soap. And when she'd finished, she was 7 years of age, and when she'd finished the steps, Mum thought that was it, she'd done what she'd got to do. And they said, another bucket of water and you go to the top and you do them all again. And she said at the end of it her hands were bleeding through the soap and the coldness of the building, but they didn't really do much about that. The punishment was they had to put their hands in their own urine. They used to give her a bucket which she had to use, and then the punishment was the nurse stood there till she held her hands in it, till they smarted. She met my father shortly after she came out of the workhouse. He was 18, Mum was 17, and they got married at St Matthew's Church. He said, and now that we are married, he said, you'll never work, I'll work to keep you. He says, you've worked all your childhood and you'll not work no more. And she didn't. And they were very happy, they had a good life.
I used to go to the Wycliffe Sunday School, and it was a very happy little chapel, only just up the road. And I was practising this hymn. We wasn't allowed to have a sheet in front of us. We had to learn everything up. And the hymn was, there's a hand for little children above the bright blue skies. And it was my birthday, the 18th of May, and I was having a party, and suddenly my father come up and lashed out at me. And I just cried, and it was only many, many later years that he told me that was the hymn that they had to sing after they had stripped and beaten his brother with a birch for trying to escape. He said, and he never believed again. He became a complete atheist.
Molly Malloy's grandfather, a policeman decorated for bravery, had died at the age of 32. The workhouse was the only home left for his young sons, Tommy, aged 7, and his brother Jack, aged 9. Jack was caught trying to escape.
He was taken into this big hall, and he was stripped in front of there were 5 of them, 5 of the boys, and they made my father witness it, not the younger brothers, but my father had to witness this beating. And they put him over a bench, like a bench, and it was a proper birch. He said, and they kept birching him, till he was screaming for mercy. And then the matron took him away and rubbed salt into his wounds. He said it was terrible, it should never have been such a place. He said people were cruel and cold. He said, and he was a criminal of want. He always said that. He was a criminal of want and poverty.
None at all. She never knew happiness as a child. She never knew what love was because the mother couldn't give it to her. There was too many and too much stress and poverty.
A lot of things I don't approve of with youngsters having life so easy today, but I shouldn't want them to have to go through any of that. It's nobody's fault if you're homeless, is it?
There's a refuge for all that is broke to the world, where one looks like another perhaps at first sight, where the dresses ain't smart and the hair ain't curled, and the heart's mostly heavy. It's the diet that's light. It's the workhouse, I mean, and the Christmas, the singing, and the singing is fine, and there's sure to be someone to sing Auld Lang Syne, and the missus she cries, and I feels for me hat. But we listens together, aye, and there's something in that.
Fruit is stronger than fiction.
A chewing gum called Sorbits.
It's more risky,
Get them off and someone should crunch them.
more explosive, more starchy.
This is the sound of addicts greeting. Let's not get too saucy.
Jonathan Ross presents Fantastic Facts, Wednesdays at 7 on Central. To wildlife artist Wolfgang Weber, there's only one place to paint his favorite subjects, in their natural habitats. Of course, being an artist's model is all very well, but it can get boring. Not like the Wednesday Night Survival Special at 8.